So, let's settle deeper into the quilt of history. We've talked about first and second sleep, but let's take a closer look at what people actually did in the middle of the night. Because this watch wasn't just dead time, it was a whole mini-life of its own. For the religiously inclined, this was prime prayer time. Manuals from the Middle Ages recommended using the wakeful hours for contemplation. Monks were, of course, the professionals at this. They even had bells scheduled at midnight or around 2 a.m. to drag everyone out of bed for chanting. And imagine that, being shaken awake in a freezing stone monastery, shuffling into the chapel half asleep, muttering psalms while trying not to yawn. Which, honestly, sounds suspiciously like every high school assembly I've ever been to. But ordinary people weren't off the hook either. In Catholic households, you might slip in a few Ave Marias. In Protestant ones later on, you'd mutter a psalm or two. The dark was thought to be full of danger, so prayers helped guard against, well, everything from demons to digestive issues. Now, not everyone was spiritual about it. Some people just chatted. Letters and diaries from the 16th and 17th centuries mention couples talking in bed during the watch. They discussed household plans, debts, gossip. Basically the same pillow talk couples have today, except without smartphones to scroll while pretending to listen. And then, yes, the other main activity, marital relations. Physicians of the time even recommended the midnight watch as the perfect moment for it. The body was refreshed from the first sleep. The mind was relaxed and, let's be honest, the alternative was staring at the ceiling beams until sunrise. So yes, first and second sleep gave people time for intimacy, and doctors wrote about it as though it was the most natural thing in the world. But not everyone enjoyed this rhythm. Enter the early modern elites who, predictably, found a way to complicate everything. By the 17th century, wealthy people started staying up later. Candlelight was still expensive. But hey, if you've got money to burn, literally, why not throw in a few extra hours of late-night card games, poetry readings, or dramatic sulking? Take Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. His entire life was basically one long performance. The court of Versailles was obsessed with ritual, and the king's bedtime was no exception. Every evening, there was the coucher, the royal going-to-bed ceremony. Ministers and favorites jostled for the honor of holding his candle or fluffing his pillow. Imagine dozens of aristocrats crowding around to watch one man get tucked in. That was the height of ambition, because nothing says prestige like being the guy who helped a monarch change into his pajamas. And the thing is, Louis didn't even sleep alone. He often had courtiers right there in the room, sometimes literally sleeping on pallets nearby. Royal privacy was a foreign concept. In fact, intimacy and politics mixed constantly in those bedchambers. Even Charles II of England, notorious for his mistresses, often had a bedchamber packed with attendants who were supposed to politely ignore whatever was going on. So yes, while peasants were crowding into a hay-stuffed mattress with family and livestock, kings were also dealing with crowded beds, just of a different sort. But if you were neither peasant nor king, say, you were an ordinary artisan or merchant, your sleep life was still shaped by the dark. People worried about thieves, fires, or worse. Cities had night watchmen, but these were less heroic guardians and more like bored guys carrying lanterns, occasionally shouting, "All's well," to prove they hadn't dozed off. And yet, despite their presence, houses still caught fire with alarming regularity. Wooden beams, straw roofs, and candles don't mix well, which meant every flicker of light in the night carried both comfort and danger. Now, speaking of danger, superstition loved the dark. Night was the witching hour, literally. People believed demons and spirits were most active between midnight and 3 a.m. If you woke up during the watch, you might interpret it as a spiritual attack. Manuals suggested prayers, holy water, or in some cases, a stiff drink, which honestly still sounds like modern coping mechanisms for insomnia. Dreams, too, were taken very seriously. Without Freud around to complicate everything, dreams were often seen as omens. A dream of water might mean travel. A dream of teeth falling out usually meant death in the family. Which is a shame, because by that standard, half the medieval population was apparently doomed every night. Now, let's slide into the actual beds of history, because here things get wonderfully awkward. The poorest families often didn't even have beds in the way we imagine them. Straw pallets on the floor, sometimes with a rough blanket, sometimes not. Straw had to be changed regularly, otherwise it became, shall we say, a petri dish of medieval wildlife. Rats, fleas, lice, you name it, it was in the mattress. And no, medieval people weren't oblivious to it. They complained constantly in writings and folk songs, which means even then, bedtime was more itchy than dreamy. The middle class had wooden frames with rope lattices. You've probably heard the phrase, sleep tight? That comes from tightening the ropes under the mattress so you didn't sag into the floor. Every so often you had to retighten them to avoid literally rolling into your bedfellow, which if that bedfellow was a snoring cousin, was probably not ideal. Wealthier folks went big. Carved wooden frames, feather mattresses, canopies with curtains to keep out drafts, and sometimes even fur blankets. And yet comfort is relative. Those feather mattresses were basically enormous sacks that sagged into lumps. You'd spend half the night rolling downhill into the middle crease. And then there's the social side of bed sharing. Inns, for example, were notorious. Travelers didn't usually get private rooms. You'd share a bed with strangers. Diaries mention men waking up next to drunk companions, grumbling about how they'd stolen the covers, or worse. Picture Airbnb, but instead of shared room, it's literally the same mattress with a random guy named Hans. Let's not forget children. In crowded households, kids often slept wherever there was space, with parents, inside cradles, or piled up together, which sounds sweet until you realize houses were smoky, drafty, and loud. Infants slept in cradles near the hearth, partly for warmth, partly because firelight was seen as protective. Because in an age without baby monitors, your only security system was hoping demons didn't feel like stealing the baby that night. And speaking of fires, candles in bedrooms were always a risk. We have records of entire houses going up in flames because someone dozed off with a candle burning too close to the bed. People tried to mitigate this with metal holders, but still, fires were constant threats. Which makes it even more ironic that we now buy scented candles to relax before sleep. One of the oddest things about pre-electric sleep is how public it was. Today, we treat sleep as private and personal, but in earlier centuries, it was part of communal life. Entire households went to bed together. Servants slept near their masters. Guests were often accommodated by squeezing into the same bed. And aristocrats? They turned their bedtime into a ritual others were invited to watch. It wasn't until the 18th and 19th centuries, with the spread of gas and later electric lighting, that people started staying up later and trying to compress sleep into one block. The segmented model faded, replaced by the modern 8 hours straight ideal, which ironically has led to more anxiety about sleep than ever. But back in the candlelit centuries, no one thought twice about waking up for an hour or two, whispering prayers, sipping ale, or just lying quietly in the dark. Maybe we've lost something by cramming our sleep into a single chunk. Or maybe we've just traded fleas and straw mattresses for the glow of blue light keeping us up until 3 a.m. So, we've been floating through medieval nights filled with fleas, whispered prayers, and the occasional midnight knock at your neighbor's door. But the story of sleep doesn't just stop there, because by the 18th and 19th centuries, the entire rhythm of human rest started to shift. And like most things in history, you can thank technology, money, and a little bit of good old-fashioned social pretension. Let's start with lighting. Candles had always been expensive. Beeswax candles, the nice kind, were basically luxury items. Tallow candles, the cheap ones made from animal fat, smelled like a wet dog wrapped in bacon grease. So for centuries, the dark was simply accepted. You didn't stay up all night unless you were wealthy enough to burn through wax like it was no big deal. But then came gaslight. By the late 18th century, cities started piping gas into street lamps, and eventually, homes. Suddenly, night wasn't quite so absolute. Streets glowed, shops stayed open later, and people discovered that, shockingly, they actually liked being awake after sunset. Coffee houses boomed, taverns filled, theaters pushed their shows later. And what does that mean for sleep? It got delayed. Instead of nodding off at sunset, people now stayed up into what we'd call normal evening hours, which sounds reasonable, until you realize that work still started at dawn. So you can see the problem. Society essentially invented insomnia. Doctors in the 18th and 19th centuries started to complain about nervous disorders caused by late nights. Aristocrats, of course, leaned into it. Staying up absurdly late became a mark of sophistication. If you were wealthy, you could sleep until noon anyway, so why not make 2 a.m. your bedtime? Letters from fashionable Londoners described late-night salons, gambling marathons, and endless card games by candlelight. Imagine being a servant, waiting for your employer to finally finish his 6-hour round of whist so you could collapse into bed yourself. Meanwhile, the poor didn't have that luxury. Gaslight might glow in the streets, but in cramped working-class housing, darkness still fell fast. Workers had to be up early, especially as industrial schedules grew harsher. So for them, the old segmented sleep patterns lingered longer. People still went to bed early, woke in the middle, and drifted back off until dawn. But the cultural tide was turning against it. Doctors started writing as if straight through the night sleep was the proper way to rest, and two-phase sleeping was framed as old-fashioned or even unhealthy, which is ironic, considering it had been humanity's default for centuries. Let's pause for a royal example, because you know monarchs never miss a chance to make something boring unnecessarily dramatic. Queen Victoria, who reigned for much of the 19th century, was famously particular about her sleep. She liked order. Bedtime was routine, and she expected her staff to keep it so. Yet even she wasn't immune to the effects of late-night society. Court balls, operas, and endless political dinners stretched into the small hours. There are diary entries from her grumbling about exhaustion and headaches, basically the royal version of writing "can't even" in your journal. Her children, too, grew up in this new world of late evenings and compressed mornings. By their time, the idea of getting up at midnight to pray was basically unheard of. First and second sleep had quietly slipped into the past, replaced by something we now recognize. Too little rest, too much stimulation, and endless complaints about being tired. Sound familiar? But let's float away from palaces and gas lamps and settle into something more personal, because one of the stranger aspects of this period was the obsession with how you slept, not just when. In the 18th century, physicians recommended all sorts of bizarre sleeping positions. One doctor suggested lying on your right side first, then flipping to your left halfway through the night, because apparently your organs needed equal treatment. Another insisted that sleeping on your back would invite nightmares and melancholy vapors, which honestly sounds like every sleep blog on the internet, just with fancier wording. And then there were the nightcaps. Not the drinks, though those too, but literal caps. People wore little cloth hats to bed, partly for warmth, partly to keep their hair somewhat tidy. If you've ever seen a cartoon of Scrooge in his long nightshirt and floppy hat, yes, that was real. People actually did that. And yes, it looked as silly as you're imagining. Beds themselves also kept evolving. Four-poster beds with heavy curtains became symbols of wealth and respectability. Curtains weren't just decorative, they were insulation. Drafty houses meant freezing nights, and those thick hangings trapped heat in. Unfortunately, they also trapped smells, which, given the lack of hygiene, were not exactly floral. Now, let's glide into the Industrial Revolution, because if there's one thing guaranteed to ruin humanity's natural rhythms, it's the combination of machines, factories, and capitalism. Factory whistles replaced roosters as alarm clocks. Work shifts grew longer, harsher, and less forgiving. Suddenly, sleep was something to be minimized in the name of productivity. Workers often staggered home exhausted, collapsing into bed for a few hours before being jolted awake again. For them, the romantic first and second sleep pattern didn't survive the grind. It was crushed into whatever scraps of rest they could find between shifts. Doctors, ever eager to diagnose, began to talk about sleep debt. This wasn't the sleep hygiene advice of today, with lavender sprays and white noise machines. It was more like, if you're exhausted, it's your fault for being weak. Thanks, doc. That really helps. Of course, elites still found ways to make sleep sound glamorous. Aristocrats bragged about how little they slept, as though insomnia were proof of genius. Napoleon famously claimed he only needed a few hours of sleep each night. Which might sound impressive until you remember he also lost most of his wars and ended up exiled on a rock. So maybe he should have napped more. Writers, too, leaned into the mystique of sleeplessness. Romantic poets like Byron and Shelley waxed lyrical about midnight musings, claiming inspiration struck when others slept. Which is another way of saying they stayed up too late, probably drunk, scribbling verses while servants refilled their lamps. But ordinary people, they missed the old rhythm. Diaries and letters from the early 19th century show lingering mentions of segmented sleep, especially in rural areas. Farmers still went to bed with the sun, woke in the middle of the night, then went back down until dawn. But by mid-century, city life, gaslight, and industrial schedules had buried that habit. And here's where things get truly ironic. Today, scientists studying sleep disorders stumbled across old references to segmented sleep and went, wait, was this normal? Turns out yes. Historical records across Europe, and even in some colonial accounts, show people casually describing first sleep and second sleep, as if everyone knew what it was, which they did, until they didn't. Until gaslight and factories rewrote the script. So the way you probably sleep now, collapsing for one long, restless stretch, maybe waking up once to check your phone, that's not humanity's timeless default. It's a historical accident, born from technology, economy, and a little bit of social vanity. Which, when you think about it, makes staying up at 2 a.m. scrolling TikTok feel almost traditional. Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little bit different. So, put your phone down, dim the lights, and if you're the sort who insists on doom scrolling while lying in bed, At least, let me give you something boring to listen to while you do it. Because tonight's topic is sleep. Not your sleep, which, let's be honest, you're probably messing up already, but the sleep of people before electricity. When the world was dark, candles were expensive, and night was basically one big question mark filled with superstition, gossip, and very weird bedtime habits. Now, before you imagine medieval peasants tucking themselves in like well-behaved toddlers, let me just say, no. Sleep was messy, interrupted, and often social. In fact, people didn't even expect to sleep through the night in one clean block. They did something called segmented sleep, or first and second sleep, which sounds like a bad Netflix sequel, but really it was their normal routine. So let's wander into this strange world, where nights stretched longer than attention spans, and people used that time to pray, complain, or sometimes sneak out for a visit. The idea of first sleep and second sleep is one of those historical facts that historians love to bring up at dinner parties, right after they've made everyone uncomfortable by talking about plague statistics. Essentially, people would fall asleep not long after sunset, because, well, what else were you going to do? You don't exactly binge a medieval Netflix show, unless you count staring at a candle and hoping it doesn't set your house on fire. So bedtime came early. Families, often in one crowded bed, would drift off. After about 4 or 5 hours, though, they'd wake up again. Not all at once, and not in some alarm clock sense, but slowly, naturally, in that hazy state between rest and wakefulness. This was the watch. And what did they do in this midnight intermission? Well, it depended. The pious might get up and pray. Monks especially loved this break because it gave them an excuse to shuffle into the chapel and chant at ungodly hours, literally. Others might chat, gossip, or even, let's just say, strengthen the family line, while the kids were still half asleep in the corner. And some, they went to visit neighbors. Imagine waking up at midnight, knocking on the door next door and saying, "Hey, couldn't sleep, thought I'd come by." Perfectly normal back then. Today, you'd probably get arrested. After this midnight wakefulness, people would go back to bed for their second sleep, which would carry them into the morning. Now, you might think, that sounds exhausting. But honestly, it was natural. With no artificial light to suppress melatonin, the human body just drifted into this rhythm. Which, let's face it, might have been better than doom scrolling until 2 a.m. and wondering why you're wrecked at work the next day. But let's float back in time a little. Long before electricity, even before the Middle Ages, ancient people already had some quirky sleep habits. Take the Romans. These guys had no problem with a midday nap, the meridiatio, which was basically their version of the siesta. You've heard of early to bed, early to rise? The Romans went with early to bed, early to rise. Nap anyway. Because when you live in a city filled with public baths, gladiator fights, and more political drama than a reality TV show, you probably need the extra shut-eye. Night, however, was complicated. Romans distrusted it. Darkness was the time of thieves, ghosts, and occasionally, awkward poetry readings. So instead of fully embracing nighttime, they lived around it. Some wealthier Romans even kept slaves awake to guard them during the night, which is definitely one way to outsource your insomnia. And then there's the whole matter of the bed. Today, we like to think of beds as private, cozy sanctuaries. But in history, beds were often communal. Entire families, and sometimes servants, would pile into the same space. Not exactly the stuff of sleep hygiene experts. The warmth was nice in drafty houses, but privacy was non-existent. Imagine trying to fall asleep while your uncle is loudly snoring 2 inches away, and the family dog is wedged between your feet. Even royals weren't immune. Yes, they had big fancy beds with canopies and curtains, but don't let the luxury fool you. Court life was crowded. Servants often slept on the floor nearby, and bedchambers were more like living rooms where half the court wandered in and out. The king's bed wasn't just for sleep. It was a political stage. Ministers, petitioners, and yes, sometimes gossipy courtiers would gather there. If you thought checking your work email in bed was bad, imagine negotiating a tax policy while still half under the covers. Candles and oil lamps gave a little relief from darkness, but they weren't exactly efficient. Candles were expensive, smoky, and dangerous. Oil lamps weren't much better unless you liked the smell of burning fish oil wafting into your dreams, which apparently some people tolerated. Most households, though, simply didn't have the resources to light up the night. Once the sun went down, life slowed, and bed, whether you liked it or not, became the main entertainment. Now, let's pause for a moment here, because it's easy to assume people were just lying around in total boredom. But actually, this segmented sleep pattern gave people time for reflection, conversation, and community. Modern scientists even think it might have been healthier for mental health. giving the brain a chance to process stress in the middle of the night instead of bottling it all up until morning. Of course, people back then weren't exactly writing wellness blogs about it. They just did it, which somehow feels more peaceful than our modern obsession with hacking sleep with apps and supplements.